this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. January 26th, 2011. I guess by all measure is kind of an innocuous date. I don't remember what I was doing on that date. And unless it's your birthday, perhaps, or you had some seminal event that occurred, most of us would just look at that date and just kind of march on. That's what we do, right, in life. But for one family, that date marks a moment in time that will be forever written in their hearts. It's the date of the death of Ellen Greenberg. And it also marks that moment in time when both her mama and her daddy were scarred forever. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Brother Dave, 14 years later. And we have had, I don't know, people throw around the term seismic many times, but we've had kind of a seismic shift, I think, just in the past 48 hours relative to this case that it's gone on and on forever and ever involving Ellen and her death. And there's been a ruling on the civil side of all of this. And I think that it is kind of a seismic, at least when you look at it from the perspective of the family. Would you agree with that?
Yes, 100%, because we have the death of Ellen Greenberg, and you and Nancy Grace have done a remarkable job of studying this case, and you know more about it than a lot of the investigators probably. And I have wondered ever since we've started with this show of how is it possible that in Ellen Greenberg's case that she could have so many injuries, have her death ruled a homicide, and then without explanation, without warning, it's changed from homicide to suicide and sits there for the next 14 years with the family, the parents going through the most heartbreaking of cases, just trying to get justice for their daughter. They don't believe for a second that she committed suicide. The facts don't seem to bear it out, but they've been like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill.
Yeah.
And yeah. I'm blown away that thankfully today we actually are able to talk about some movement forward that actually makes sense. And we have a medical examiner, Dr. Osbourne, who actually is the guy who originally said it was a homicide and then changed to suicide, and has refused to change it back since. And I don't even know how that plays out, Joe. I hope you can explain it.
So I am gonna kind of lay that out here. Lord knows, when you get look, there are no guarantees in this life that you're going to have peace. I think people labor under that delusion that life is going to be perfect when you get to be a certain age. And it's not. As a matter of fact, you have all kinds of things that happen. But for them, being up in age, and they were residents up in PA, and when all of this happened, and people don't realize that Greenberg is a clinician. I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, he was a dentist.
Right.
He has a baseline understanding of pathology and human disease pathology, and here's another thing that he understands. He understands biomechanics, the way the human body moves. And I think for someone to sit there and you're trying to explain to him from a medical legal perspective that this is in fact plausible, that his daughter could have self-inflicted 20 Some people say more because there's some overlapping, but 20 sharp force injuries, and not to mention multiple contusions over the surface of her body. I think that it would give anybody pause, but you have somebody that has a scientific mind like him, and the equation just doesn't add up, if you apply the logic to it. And I think that was one of the big driving forces, and then, to try to explain this away, to try to say that this is in fact suicide is very, very difficult. But, back to my case in point, I don't know if many people understand the financial burden that this has just wrecked on this family. And because they have literally given up everything. I mean, they've had to sell their house. They've moved away to another state now. And it has been such a grind, Dave, for them. And you look at this, and this precious child that you held in your arms and that you nurtured, and and she raised to adulthood, that's actually out there functioning, got a job, the whole 9 yards, and is in a relationship. It's everything that you could probably want. I'm sure that there were problems. Everybody has them. We're not free in this life of problems. There's no guarantees. But you get them to this point, and the next thing you know, she's found with a knife sticking out of her chest in her kitchen, in this kind of weird position on the floor, in an apartment that was locked from the inside.
Can we break that down a little bit, Joe? For those who don't know the case as well as you do, or even me, the death of Ellen Greenberg happened on a blizzard, as the blizzard is on the way.
Yeah.
And in Philadelphia, and she's a teacher at school, engaged, and she gets home. She stops for gas on the way home because, most of us know when you have bad weather on the way, you go ahead and get extra gas in your car just in case. Yep. And that's what she did. Stops by, gets gas, and goes home. Now, she's preparing dinner. She's got food on the counter. She's cutting up a salad and some other things. Her boyfriend, or fiance rather, leaves the apartment to go to the gym on site to work out. And in between the time that he leaves the apartment to go work out and the time that he returns, Ellen Greenberg decides, you know what, I'm tired of cutting up this salad. I'm tired of thinking about getting married. I'm tired of thinking about my career. And you know what? It's just time for me to leave. Yeah. And that's the story we were told to believe. And up until the last 48 hours. And then what takes place physically, to her, that up until now, they've suggested that she did this to herself. She tortured herself in such a way, Joe. I can't even physically figure out how you would inflict all this damage on yourself, no matter how committed you were. It boggles my mind. So did I set the table up properly to get to the point? Okay.
No, you did, brother. And that's the thing about it, with this, it's one thing. And I've had people ask me over these many years that Nancy and I and others have, and my friend Gavin Fish have been talking about Ellen's case. Mm-hmm. Well, Morgan, you're the one that was, in the trenches, and you worked as a medical legal death investigator. Have you ever seen self-inflicted stab wounds or cuttings? Well, cuttings and stab wounds are let's say incised wounds are different. If you think about people that have sliced their wrist, okay, in an attempt to take their own life, yes. And I've seen various modalities. I've seen everything from butcher knives to, as we say in South Louisiana, filet knives. I've seen Red Devil razor blades, scraping razor blades with actual duct tape taped around the blunt edge so that they can maintain a grip on it. A lot of planning went into that. So yes, the incised wounds as a means to take one's own life do in fact happen. More rare, however, are stab wounds. And just so that we're clear, stab wounds, literally taking the business end of the knife, that sharp point, and driving it into one's person, okay, into a potentially fatal location. That has happened, but Dave, that is by far the exception as opposed to the norm. I think that people, even in a heightened state of I don't know how to say it, psychiatric distress, for instance, even that is really off-putting for them to think about stabbing oneself. And you have to do it many times, because you don't know if you're actually going to strike a vital area. Because just because you stab yourself does not mean that it's going to end your life. With Ellen, we've got, as people have stated, and as I've previously stated, 20 stab wounds, and they are not anatomically consistent throughout. And I'm talking about just the anatomical makeup of the location of the injuries. They cover her, Dave. They're both anterior, which means front, and posterior. And not just posterior, but we're talking about getting into, literally, we're talking about getting into the cranial vault, where we're talking about going near the brainstem, brushing up against it, which is one of the big bones of contention in this case, and has been. There was a pathologist at the medical examiner's office in Philly, not Osbourne, one of his colleagues, that was actually deposed because she had viewed the samples and everything, and she actually concluded that Ellen sustained postmortem injuries, particularly one of these in the back of her neck. Now, how do you explain that? And that's the toughest thing here.
Total number of injuries, Joe. How many times did she actually have knife injuries to her body?
Yeah, right at 20. And there has been, over a period of time, I think some people have questioned an assessment. And this is not, I'm not throwing, as the young folks say, I'm not throwing shade on Dr. Osbourne here.
Right.
But one can have overlapping injuries. We get it a lot with gunshot wounds. We have multiple gunshot wounds, or where you have multiple assaults, like blunt force trauma that leave lacerations, and you'll have these communicating injuries. There's a couple of injuries that they thought might communicate, or it may have been one as opposed to. And again, it comes back to how much can you tolerate as an individual who is self-inflicting these insults. And that's the big question, isn't it, Dave? Can a young woman who has her life laid out before her suddenly, in the midst of food preparation, stare down at a household kitchen knife and decide in that one moment that she is in fact going to end her life there on the floor of where she has prepared meals for many, many months? I want to tell you something, Dave. I've had, when you can elicit, most of the time when you can elicit a response from a forensic pathologist in the autopsy room like that, there's kind of this moment in time when forensic pathologists, you open the bag for the first time, the body bag, and when you can elicit a response from the forensic pathologist of, "Oh my," it's a moment that you should mark, I think, because most of the time nothing really phases them, and most of the time you're going to see this when you have multiple injuries, like grossly over the top. And I can only imagine when Dr. Osbourne walked into the autopsy suite that day, and the techs are there, the photographers are there, and they unzip that bag and pull that flap back. And here you have this young woman that's laid out before you, and she's got multiple stab wounds all over her body. And listen, we're talking about Philly, Dave. This is nothing in that environment for them to see a gross amount of trauma on a body. But even I think that it would give him pause at that moment in time to say, well, let's try to work this out. And you know what? One of the most difficult things about trying to understand multiple trauma like this as it applies to sharp force injuries is doing what we refer to as tracking wounds. Because there's so much study that you have to do externally. I mean, this is a very involved autopsy. We're talking about, first off, taking photographs of the body if the body still has clothing on, and I think in her case she did, and then trying to marry up any of the little incised. If you think about taking a piece of cloth and cutting a slit in it, trying to look, because clothing is, everybody understands this. Clothing is not static like our skin is. You're still going to have individuals that when you look at the injuries or the cuts in the clothing, is it possible that you can look at the clothing and marry up the defect in the cloth with the stab wound? And that's just the beginning, beyond, we do, x-rays and all those sorts of things. Then you take the clothing off and you hold it up, you examine it, you photograph it, and you allow it to dry. You put it in what's referred to as a forensic clothes dryer, which we could get into that. It's a separate low humidity kind of thing that we use. Then you have to go in and actually physically look at the injury, still external, before you ever open the body. It's a daunting task, but here's the thing. Every time you look at one of these injuries and you try to compare it once you open the body up, you track the wound. And one of the things you're doing with tracking the wound, you're looking for, well, what underlying vessels or organs are involved, okay? You try to look at the location. And then probably one of the biggest things is you try to see if there's actually hemorrhage in the wound tract. Now, Dave, I got to tell you, most of the injuries that Ellen Greenberg sustained had hemorrhage in the wound tract, okay? They were there. However, one of the critical locations where there was no hemorrhage in the wound tract was the aforementioned insult to the back of her head per this consulting or the colleague of Dr. Osbourne, who was a forensic pathologist. So I've always been fascinated by that. And the level of injuries that have been sustained, how do you move on from that? And how do you try to square that in your mind with these pain centers that are firing? I think that you're kind of a handy man around the house. How many times have you swung a hammer and maybe, what was it the old preacher said? I don't normally cuss, but if there's a cuss word in me, it'll bring it out.
Yeah, there you go. That's me.
You hit your thumb with a hammer. Well, that's pain response. Okay. And most people can identify with that. Tripping over a piece of furniture in the middle of the night, bruising your shin, stubbing your toe. Those are pain responses. Dave, we're talking 20 times, brother.
That's my problem with all of this, Joe. You actually pointed out to me how oftentimes in a suicide, there will be more than one mark. There will almost be a practice attempt.
Yes, it can happen.
I was fascinated by that in the science, psychological, scientific, knowing all the different issues that go along to that. I don't want to. When I say fascinated, I hope nobody thinks I'm being flippant, because I don't mean
body bags, brother. Yeah, that's what we do. And you have to be fascinated by it. You have to be. And that's what we're here for. We're here for the science to try to understand it. Because I got to tell you, I still don't. It's hard for me to comprehend, I think, to try to understand it.
But that's where, with all of this, Joe, how is it possible that you could these injuries are traumatic. Several of them are beyond anything, that you could imagine. And to rule it as suicide, one has to believe that in the midst, that all of a sudden in her apartment, as she's preparing dinner, she decides to kill herself. And this is all the lead up time to what was taking place in the minutes before. There's nothing there that says something was going wrong with her at that moment. There's none of that.
Listen, half the world has anxiety. Half the world has depression. If you went down your street, every other house is going to have some kind of, medication that somebody's on. Okay.
Thankfully.
That's nothing new under the sun. Okay. But did her diagnoses of these issues that she was, and she's planning a wedding, the save the date card, all that stuff is going out. And do you have enough to hang your hat on to say that, okay, this is now jumped from a moment in time where, I'm stable. I've been teaching my classes. I'm not missing work, all that sort of thing, to, okay, not only am I going to end my life, I'm going to end my life arguably in one of the most horrific ways that you can. It doesn't mesh. And, we're not here to do, and I hate this term, but we're not here to do a psychological autopsy. And that's for other people, if you even believe that term, which I have trouble with many times. You can go back and retroactively look at people's psychiatric records and then, what are people saying around them that are in their world. But just if you're looking at this from the physical science standpoint and you're a clinician and you're trying to understand what happened, then I think that it's important. And Dave, there's a term, and you and I had mentioned this last night. We talked about this, prior to laying this down today. There's a term that physicians use, and it's called a differential diagnosis. And that's where you have multiple indicators of some type of indwelling disease or pathology that's going on, or manifestations, physical manifestations. And it could be this, or it could be that. Okay. You don't really know. You're trying to kind of narrow it down. You get a bunch of people around, you're looking at lab results, they're scratching their heads and they're saying, oh, okay, I think that this is maybe a bowel obstruction, and I'm just throwing this out there, a bowel obstruction, or I don't know, they've got some other manifestation in their digestive tract. Dave, ultimately the diagnosis has been made. Let's take Osbourne out of the context of law enforcement, which he is not.
Right.
He is a medical examiner. Okay. Homicides are not all he deals with. All right. Matter of fact, they're the lowest end of what he deals with. You deal with fewer homicides than you do anything else. Okay. So he's always having to make diagnosis. Well, his ultimate diagnosis, Dave, based upon the empirical scientific data, was first an undetermined. And I think initially a homicide, undetermined.
Correct.
And then you land on suicide. First off, do you know how rare it is that a forensic pathologist will change that ruling multiple times? Dave, we only have 5 choices here. We'll go over them again. Natural.
Okay, please do, because whenever we talk about this, I think people get kind of confused at the terminology if you're not in the field. And it does, when we think about homicide, suicide, there are some just crossover. We kind of mess things up. In our thinking.
And everybody does. One of the most cringe moments I'll ever have is when I see a reporter come on the air, and they're breathlessly outside the medical examiner's office getting that shot, for the 6 o'clock news, and they say the medical examiner has ruled the cause of death as homicide.
Right.
Well, sugar, that ain't.
Yeah, but you know what? You say that, Joe. I've done that. I have been that guy, and thankfully you corrected me. I'm not kidding. I was able to go back and change what I said because I was like, I didn't know that. I'm an idiot.com.
that's not a cause of death. That is a manner of death. And we only have 5 that we can choose from. Our doctor has used 3. He only got 5. He's used 3, 1, 2, 3. And now, you begin to think about a lot of the other stuff that, that you consider went on with this case. I think probably, again, one of the most glaring things is that, you've got arguably one of the most famous, I don't know, she's a neuropathologist, literally one of the pioneers as far as women go in the field of neuropathology, Lucy Rourke Adams, claiming that Ellen's case that was consulted out to her. And Lucy Rourke Adams, who is in her 90s, states that I've never seen this case. This was never sent to me. And so you combine things like that with this jumping around of this terminal ruling as far as the classification of manner of death. And it certainly gives you pause, but it also erodes any kind of trust that you might have. So, when it comes down to Ellen, we have finally landed in a place where maybe we're starting to see a few rays of sunshine break on the horizon. Maybe, just maybe, there's going to be some more definitive answers coming down the track. There's, by my way of thinking at least, there's little or no joy in anything involving a homicide of your child. Let's see, what would be a better word? I don't know. Maybe peace. I don't know if victory, because I can't imagine finding victory in this. Validation, hope, maybe. People throw that term around a lot, but hope that before you finally close your eyes, breathe your last breath, that you screaming from the rooftops has had an impact finally on the perception of your precious child. I don't know. Justice, which is always kind of a mushy thing, that people say, do people ever attain justice? I don't know. But Dave, based upon what we heard in the last 48 hours, I think that we've got some pause to perhaps be at least intrigued, right, and perhaps bearing witness to some peace coming down the road for the Greenbergs.
I think that's important because you're talking about 14 years. All right. When their daughter, when Ellen Greenberg died, it was ruled a homicide because it appeared to be anyway. It appeared to be, a homicide based on the injuries, the number, the type, all those things. And so they prepared, for the funeral and life without our daughter, and let's find the killer. Well, when her death was ruled, it was changed from homicide to suicide. They were given no warning. It was just pull the rug out from underneath, and let them fall. And ever since then, they haven't been fighting to have it changed to homicide. They've been fighting just to have it ruled undetermined is better than suicide. Yeah. And they just want, you and I have talked about peace and things like that and justice and moving on. And in reality, you've got a really big hole in your heart already. This is your daughter. And now, for whatever reason, you're looking at something that really does seem jacked up. It seems like something really wrong is happening here. And we're talking about a cover-up. We're talking about the basics of life in the United States of America, of what we expect and demand of our public servants. Look, you're going to protect and serve? Great. Protect and serve us all. You got to serve the family here. What happened to Ellen Greenberg? And they've been trying to get this looked at, reopened ever since. And finally, they had, you and I have covered them many times. They have filed different suits or tried to get something done. They've hired experts. Yes. You and Nancy did a reenactment or actually had a stage thing, because there were so many parts of the scene of the crime that made absolutely no sense based on what we were told in official statements. When you give a statement to police of what you saw when you got there and what you did when you got, all those things. And you're going, the one that sticks out to me. Yeah. Ellen Greenberg's body is found leaning up against a cabinet, sitting butt on the ground, back against the cabinet.
Yes.
And yet she has a horizontal line of blood going from her nose to her ear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the world in which we live, that is not a possibility.
No, it's not. It's an empirical impossibility that the flow of any kind of liquid, blood obviously is more viscous than water, but that is a telltale sign of manipulation, perhaps, of the body, that the body has been moved because of gravity, right? Which is like the one constant force. And I've talked about gravity in the sense of, in the past, postmortem lividity and those sorts of things that I love to, use as indicators for PMI. With this in particular, though, we're talking about the flow of liquid. And again, that's glaring. How in fact can you do this? Here's my thing, though, Dave. We're talking 14 years downrange now from when this happened.
Correct.
We do know that the door has been opened for the family.
Yes.
Relative to we've got, and correct me if I'm wrong, based upon the ruling, and I'll let you give more detail about the ruling, but just correct me if I'm wrong. Dr. Osbourne has stated openly now that he does not believe that this is a suicide.
He said this.
Yeah.
It is my professional opinion. Ellen's manner of death should be designated as something other than suicide.
Yeah.
He did give an example of what helped make that determination for him all these years later. He said, for example, whether Ellen's fiance was witnessed entering the apartment before placing the 911 call on January 26, 2011, whether the door was forced open as reported, and whether Ellen's body was moved by someone else inside the apartment with her at or near the time of her death. That's what Osbourne wrote as his reasons for saying, I didn't know this. This is new information to me. And when I found out, now it doesn't make any sense. And I'm thinking, we all knew that.
Yeah, I know.
How did we know that?
There were multiple consultations along the way. So right. I can't imagine that a man of this esteem, who the city of Philadelphia has put so much weight behind, here, what's the term that they love to use? Gravitas, based upon his learned abilities as a forensic pathologist, that he would not have had access to this information. I don't know. Maybe he's had that moment in time where that epiphanal moment where he can sit back and say, maybe, just maybe, my way of thinking about this was all wrong. Here's one of the things that is really troubling to me, Dave, is the idea that her remains were documented at the scene. How well were they documented? What did you miss at that moment in time? Was there anything to miss? I can assume that there was. How thorough? Because, and I'm not saying, they initially ruled this as a homicide. I think my question would be, is how enthusiastically was this case investigated as a quote unquote homicide at that moment in time? because there are certain steps, and people don't know this about death investigation. Yeah, we're human beings, and there's almost like this adrenaline boost that you get when when you walk into a scene, it's a homicide. Right, wrong, or indifferent, there's something that kicks in your brain where you're thinking, oh my God, I got to be really careful here. I got to really be thorough. I'm just questioning right now. I'm really thinking, how thorough has this been? And hopefully it has been, because, you only get those few moments, even though it seems like we stay at crime scenes forever and ever. Dave, it's a very short period of time in the whole grand timeline. Now we're talking about 14 years later. That hour or two they spent out there at that scene working that, did they do everything possible to document the dynamics of the scene? Because this is a very dynamic event that occurred in a very small space, man. Very small space. But, I am holding out hope. Tell me, just give us the quick and dirty here, brother, about what are they saying now relative to this?
Here's the big part, okay? All of this coming down because a trial was getting ready to start. They were trying to seat a jury. 2 civil suits have been filed by the Greenbergs, and they're trying to seat a jury for the first one. Now they've got 2. One was at the Supreme Court level. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court was slated to hear one of these cases later on. Now, the first suit was filed in 2019, and it was slated for a hearing before the Supreme Court. And it sought to have the manner of Ellen Greenberg's death changed from suicide back to homicide or undetermined. They had chased that through the court system all the way up to the state Supreme Court. The second suit, which was filed in 2022, slated that that was for the trial this week. That was the actual, hey, man, we're seating the jury right now. And it alleged
in a civil case.
Yes, all civil. And it alleges that the investigation into Ellen Greenberg's death was, quote, embarrassingly botched and resulted in a cover-up by Philadelphia authorities. Now, in this particular case, it sought monetary damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress against several city employees who were involved in the investigation. This is what was going on when this agreement was struck between the city and the Greenbergs, and it does impact the other case as well, because this stops everything. Okay, this, now that we're getting this from Osbourne, they've been asking Osbourne forever, change this. You can change it to undetermined. You don't have to call it we don't. That's not what we're after. We're just after the saying this is not a suicide. That's all we're saying.
I got to tell you one thing about this that had come out earlier, and I still remember this, where they were saying that we have no authority over the medical examiner.
Yep.
They're an independent entity within the governmental structure. They make these determinations. You cannot force them to do anything. Okay, because they're independent of the police. And here's the thing about it, Dave. You really wonder what the driver is behind this, because when you have a medical legal authority that changes an opinion multiple times, then you begin to think about undue influence. Is there somebody else within this construct, the investigative construct, that is pressing the buttons here? And I think that that's something that is going to be explored. I have to say, now you flip the switch, okay? Because if, in fact, they rule this as a homicide, they reclassify this as far as the manner of death. If they flip that switch, when you flip that switch and you use the H word, you set all kinds of things in motion, because you have to look at it. Okay, well, is this a cold case? No, it's not a cold case. It is
been
not.
Actively, it's only been active from the parent standpoint, though.
Right, it has, but it's kind of gone into stasis, if you will, this kind of paused moment with the authorities. Now, we're going to see if they rule this as a homicide, if they change that ruling to homicide. We're going to see how bad they want it. And I ain't talking about the Greenbergs.
Right.
I'm talking about the authorities. Because as horrible as this was for Ellen, and as what a continual assault it's been upon the Greenbergs, it does give one pause. And here it is. For every Ellen Greenberg case in Philadelphia, how many other cases are there out there where you haven't had the same time poured into it, the same resources that, mind you, almost broke the Greenberg family financially, and on one level it did. The emotional stamina. Maybe some people don't possess that. How many other cases are there? And this is a big step, I think, in trying to reassure the public that perhaps those in charge are now taking notice, and they're going to have to rebuild trust in this one area that a lot of people don't normally think about. But I think that I could say it's one of the most critical areas, because we're not talking about a park being made for kids to play in. We're not talking about after school. We're not talking about road repairs. We're talking about the most precious thing in the world, a life that was ended far too soon. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.